Hello and welcome back. I'm Dr. Marc D. Baldwin, and today I'd like to discuss Booker T. Washington and read a few passages from his excellent work, Up from Slavery. The first thing to consider about Booker T. Washington was whether or not he was a smart politician or a sellout to blacks. I don't think in either way that there's any question that he was a great black statesman. He was called the Moses of his race. And yet many people then and today call him an Uncle Tom, or even worse, that terrible derogatory and even silly slur, an Oreo. In other words, they said that he was basically kissing up to whites, and he was practicing appeasement, and he was weak, and he was giving in, and he was accepting segregation and racism and all those things. I don't believe, personally, those slurs are justified. However, that's up to you to decide. So let's look at what he has to say in a moment. Washington's counterpart was W.E.B. Du Bois. There's a very interesting parallel here historically. At the time, Washington was the more tactful, diplomatic, and nonviolent sort of politician in his attitude toward white society. And Du Bois was more of an in-your-face, militant kind of guy. Very much the same as the 60s, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King, of course, more like Washington, and Malcolm X more like Du Bois. Well, regardless of how you feel about his politics or his approach, there's no doubt whatsoever that he was a great rhetorician and orator. Rhetoric, of course, being the skillful manipulation of language. He was fantastic with his use of language. And an orator. His public speaking was second to none. He was a spellbinding speaker. This piece we're reading in this class is a speech that he gave at the Atlanta Exposition in 1895. Very interesting. Because the audience was predominantly white. They were very powerful movers and shakers, congressmen and CEOs, captains of industry, and so on. So it was a great opportunity for Washington to state his case, and he made quite a great case. He was considered and invited because he was a representative of his race. Of course, today, in our enlightened state, we look at that as a very racist sort of attitude, and no doubt it was. Nonetheless, Washington seized the moment and realized that he had a great opportunity to address some very powerful people. There's something else I want you to consider here, and that's the political viewpoints, the ideologies of conservatism versus liberalism. You have to be really careful of those terms. They've changed radically throughout the years, and they're grossly misused and misunderstood, depending on whom you talk to and talk about, and depending upon the issue, whether it's financial or social or religious or what have you. You're going to have all sorts of confusion about what's a conservative, what's a liberal point of view. It would take an entire class, actually, to try and sort it all out and work our way through it. However, in the interest of simplicity, with a concession that we might be oversimplifying things, Washington is primarily a conservative. And we'll see how that works, and I'll point out a couple of the examples of that as we allow his words to speak for themselves. I'd like to start by reading the third and fourth paragraphs in that piece. Now remember, this is from Up from Slavery, Chapter 14, the Atlanta Exposition Address. All right, let's start at the third paragraph. And as I'm reading, note the rhetoric, the pragmatism. Pragmatism is an essential American philosophy. Actually, it was born and reared in America. And in a nutshell, it's saying and doing what's diplomatically necessary to achieve a desired end. Washington is calling for blacks to make a start, to get started at whatever they can. Again, this is very practical, sensible, logical. And he stresses the work ethic, the great American work ethic, the Calvinist work ethic. Okay, so let's have a look at paragraphs 3 and 4. Mr. President and gentlemen of the Board of Directors and citizens, 1/3 of the population of the South is of the Negro race. No enterprise seeking the material, civil, or moral welfare of this section can disregard this element of our population and reach the highest success. I but convey to you, Mr. President and Directors, the sentiment of the masses of my race when I say that in no way have the value and manhood of the American Negro been more fittingly and generously recognized than by the managers of this magnificent exposition at every stage of its progress. It is a recognition that will do more to cement the friendship of the two races than any occurrence since the dawn of our freedom. Now notice that. He's taking advantage of the situation at the podium to address the President and the Board of Directors and the citizens and all these movers and shakers in here by saying maybe he's kissing up a little bit, but I suggest no, this is good rhetoric. This is good speechifying. What he's saying is thanks. Thanks for recognizing us. It's a wonderful thing, and let's be friends. Second paragraph, or rather the fourth here in the piece. Not only this, but the opportunity here afforded will awaken among us a new key era of industrial progress. Ignorant and inexperienced, it is not strange that in the first years of our new life we began at the top instead of at the bottom, that a seat in Congress or the state legislature was more sought than real estate or industrial skill, that the political convention or stump speaking had more attraction than starting a dairy farm or truck garden. Now you see what he's saying here, and I suppose it's controversial, and this is what led some to call him an Oreo or selling out or appeasing. He's saying, look, we tried to start at the top right after the Civil War, we meaning black people. Perhaps it's a better idea to start wherever we can, perhaps at the bottom, perhaps where we're familiar with, and that is working in the fields, tilling the soil, etc. Again, some people say, well, this is a terrible sellout. Others suggest that this is just practical, this is pragmatic, this is realistic. Now let's look at the last 4 lines of the 6th paragraph. No race can prosper till it learns that there is as much dignity in tilling a field as in writing a poem. It is at the bottom of life we must begin, and not at the top. Nor should we permit our grievances to overshadow our opportunities. Well, again, this is another one of those parts in the piece that have led some people to call him a sellout, an appeaser. How dare you tell us to begin at the bottom? We've been at the bottom in slavery. And that's very true. Yet throughout history and throughout life, people have begun at the bottom. Unless, of course, you're born into a fabulously wealthy family. And that last line is a fact, ladies and gentlemen. Grievance politics is the stock and trade of today's liberal politicians and many of today's social activists. Washington is saying, yes, we have grievances, but we can't wallow in them or use them as an excuse. He's very conservative in that regard. We've got to be stronger, tougher, and take self-responsibility for our lives. Please move to the last few lines now of the 7th paragraph, the last sentence in the 7th paragraph. In all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet one is the hand in all things essential to mutual progress. Well, this sure sounds like he's accepting segregation, doesn't it? From our enlightened state here in 2004, this is a very offensive thing to most of us. Yet back then it was politically realistic. Remember, he's facing a predominantly white audience who were, still then, predominantly racist in their inclinations. And their biggest fear, probably, back then was that blacks were going to try and move into their neighborhoods and socialize with them. So yes, Booker T. Washington is conceding to white society. He's basically saying, look, we don't have to play together, love together. I don't want to hang with you, but let's just work together, okay? Again, it's a politically expedient position to take at the time. Let's move to the 8th paragraph, right after that sentence, please. There is no defense or security for any of us except in the highest intelligence and development of all. If anywhere there are efforts tending to curtail the fullest growth of the Negro, let these efforts be turned into stimulating, encouraging, and making him the most useful and intelligent citizen. Effort or means so invested will pay 1,000% interest. These efforts will be twice blessed, blessing him that gives and him that takes. This is just flat out good argumentation. You've got to show the audience what's in it for them. You've got to sell them on an idea. And Washington says that whites will benefit themselves from helping blacks out of slavery. Notice that there's no defense or security for any of us. Boy, that's a very thinly veiled threat. He's suggesting, you're not going to be secure yourself unless you help us. It sure doesn't sound like selling out to me. Notice also his use of religion. He's turned himself into a preacher here before his congregation. Let's bless one another by helping one another. And then this is a great example of dialogic. Dialogic is the logic of dialogue, that once you start talking, you are in the process of creating yourself and creating a new world simply by the power of the dialogue. Let's continue right along at the 9th paragraph. There's no escape through law of man or God from the inevitable. The laws of changeless justice bind oppressor with oppressed, and close as sin and suffering join, we march to fate abreast. Well, Washington is in the process here of pulling out all the stops. He's brought God and poetry into this now. It says the oppressor and oppressed are locked up together. Whites and blacks, we're in this together. Now the 10th paragraph, he really lays it on thick. This is, to me, a threat. I don't see any other way to look at this. It's in-your-face rhetoric. He's saying either help us or you're going to go down right along with us. Nearly 16 millions of hands will aid you in pulling the load upward, or they will pull against you the load downward. We shall constitute 1/3 and more of the ignorance and crime of the South, or 1/3 its intelligence and progress. We shall contribute 1/3 to the business and industrial prosperity of the South, or we shall prove a veritable body of death, stagnating, depressing, retarding every effort to advance the body politic. Again, folks, frankly, I don't see how anybody can read that passage and say that Washington is weak or appeasing whites. He's saying, look, you've got to help us, or we're going to pull you down. Now let's move to the middle of the 13th paragraph, please. And as I read, notice that Washington is saying that the Civil War and Reconstruction is God's way of dealing with slavery in America. This echoes President Lincoln's second inaugural address when he said the same thing. He's playing on the conscience and the better angels of his white audience. He's pulling out the card of religion and Christianity, saying, look, are you good people or not, basically? Good people would help us. Good people would not any longer treat blacks as inferiors. I know you're good people, so you're going to help us. I pledge that in your effort to work out the great and intricate problem with which God has laid at the doors of the South, you shall have at all times the patient, sympathetic help of my race. Only let this be constantly in mind, that while from representations in these buildings of the product of field, of forest, of mine, of factory, letters, and art, much good will come, yet far above and beyond material benefits will be that higher good that, let us pray God, will come in a blotting out of sectional differences and racial animosities and suspicions, in a determination to administer absolute justice, in a willing obedience among all classes to the mandates of the law. This, coupled with our material prosperity, will bring into our beloved South a new heaven and a new earth. Well, there it is. That's the conclusion. He's pledging that blacks will help. In exchange for their pledge, implicitly, he's saying, now I want you to pledge that you're going to basically do what's right. Do the right thing. Well, in the interest of concision, I'm not going to read any more to you, but please do read the closing paragraphs. In these closing paragraphs, Washington talks about the reception to the speech, which was initially good, but then a very severe reaction set in. And he was called a traitor and an appeaser and a sellout and all those things I've talked about. But after a little while, there was a reconsideration, a revision. And most people thought then that perhaps his tactics, his game plan, if you will, might be the best way. Well, it's up to you to decide. What do you think about it? As I said, there was Washington and Du Bois, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King. And certainly, it's a complex, extremely important issue in America, American history, and the reverberations are still being felt in many places today. Thanks for your attention, and I'll talk to you next time.